Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all.
When I heard Trump talk about, or let's say dog whistle, about wanting to pursue a colorblind society during his inaugural speech, I knew exactly what that meant and how that was the euphemistic way to say that he was sick of uppity minorities constantly talking about their oppression. That discussing racism was the real racism because it made certain people uncomfortable.
This week, I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based.
Colorblind and merit-based.
The reason I even know what this dog whistle means is because of my years spent in the right-wing, IDWS corners of the internet. Otherwise, a younger, more naive, less online version of me might truly believe that it was a misguided attempt to pursue justice and equality for all, to judge people for the content of their characters and not the color of their skin. But having seen this slippery, colorblind talking point deployed constantly by racism apologists and racism minimizers and deniers really gives you a good grasp and understanding of what it's supposed to mean when they say it. From seeing Stefan Molyneux praiser Michael Shermer weaponize one specific MLK quote every year to seeing Quillette, aka Phrenology Mag, use these exact types of talking points in between their various articles about skull shapes, is how one really starts to understand just how these seemingly innocuous terms and views that may seem well-meaning at first glance are weaponized to fight anti-racism. Here's our pal Sam again.
You could never have been invited to TED just a few short years ago, right? Which is tantamount to saying that, Martin Luther King Jr. could not have given a TED Talk a few years ago, given the level of, ideological capture of the organization or along the lines of that we're talking about.
So, firstly, he's celebrating the shift of the Overton window to the right, and then he's comparing Coleman Hughes in this conversation. Coleman Hughes, who writes racism-denying articles for Quillette and has friendly conversations with Charles Murray, Sam's favorite type of person of color, a black guy who writes in defense of people like George Floyd murderer Derek Chauvin. He's comparing that Coleman Hughes and his racism-denying work to MLK Jr., as if he were alive today, he'd be going the Quillette and Trump-type route of color blindness. Fuck no. They love to ignore all MLK's other quotes about, white moderates, for example, and take that one quote completely out of context because it suits them to distort the essence of the message. This is a quote from another era entirely, where the fight was very different. It reflects the way to fight racism according to its time. But as racism is constantly evolving, trying to gain a foothold in various ways in modern society, our methods in combating racism must evolve accordingly. So, of course it suits bigots to point to a single out-of-context quote from decades ago and insist that we still adhere to only that, so that they can suppress any discussion of racism.
You were talking to, a very high-status audience about the virtues of maintaining colorblindness as the goal of our racial politics, and it provoked a fairly hysterical response, which was really, in my view, pathological on its face. Not really it doesn't testify to a mere difference of opinion on these issues. It testifies to a kind of brokenness of certain people and certain cultural attitude.
Remember, far-right activists and agitators like Andy Ngo and James Lindsay both have their roots in the New Atheist movement. I have often said that these scenes, New Atheism, the IDW, etc., are basically microcosms of how the far right is going to behave on a larger scale. If one is watching these scenes, they get an early preview of these talking points, and then years later, you really see them embraced by the mainstream right or the far right now, because the mainstream right in North America is like white nationalist adjacent, let's admit. It's again that online-ification, the Gamergate-ification that I was talking about. That sort of thing, those kinds of campaigns of harassment were the blueprint for what we're seeing now in U.S. government. I guess these scenes have an early overlap because they are trying to rationalize and intellectualize extremely regressive, far-right shit so much of the time. Like, that is their main purpose. So they are pretty key in helping shift that Overton window. And with New Atheism, there's the added note of despising specifically Muslims or anything Islam-related, and that too attracts a lot of extreme people and views into the scene. And the IDW just evolved from the New Atheism scene. Yeah, so I think that's why we see this stuff earlier in these spaces than when it becomes more widespread like it is now. But it's too bad no one with any significant power is listening to those who watch these particular types of online spaces, because we could warn you way in advance, way before they start dismantling entire government departments. And we do, but who's listening, huh? In fact, I can't tell you the number of times I've been told that these scenes were dead and meaningless now, and how people shouldn't even bother talking about them anymore. All said by people who simply don't take into consideration that their essence was not dead, never dead. They may seem inactive to the untrained eye, like who's really talking about atheism and New Atheism, but these scenes, they evolve, metastasize, in fact. I'm sure many of my listeners remember the outrage by some supposedly liberal podcast bros to those raising the alarm about the New Atheist merge with the far right. Those are the types that will pretend to have always been on the right side at times like this, instead of acknowledging that they were wrong to create a stink when people were trying to warn about these things. So, yeah, when it comes to paving the way for the nightmarish moment we're in right now, I've got to stress, it's not just the obvious right or even the more crypto-right scenes like New Atheism and the IDW/heterodox spheres. It's also the so-called liberal centrists and the anti-Trump right-wingers and the spineless Dems constantly capitulating to the right. All of them have helped usher this in. Rational centrist types especially, with their legitimizing of anti-left fear-mongering and anti-woke nonsense. I mean, you even have IDW critical figures nowadays who cater to the anti-woke crowd and whitewash how despicable those scenes are. They've given legitimacy to transphobes, misogynists, and genocide even. Like, just think of the role of publications like the New York Times. There's just no real strong opposition to these right-wing fear-mongering tactics. And when one buzzword becomes too exposed, they just move on to another. Like, the latest is DEI, but, when that becomes less effective, they'll find something else. And, I mean, this anti-DEI thing, it's not some well-thought-out critique of the hollowness of corporate diversity programs that don't actually achieve much. Being anti-DEI for the IDW types, the rational centrists, and now Trump and his goons, is just a paper-thin cover for saying that they want to get rid of actual diversity. This is why I found it so alarming When Sam Harris used his massive platform back in the day to defend Tucker Carlson, saying diversity is not our strength, it's why I found it alarming when he denied racism in policing repeatedly, why I found it concerning as fuck when he would refuse to acknowledge simple things like Trump saying shithole countries was not racism related, or he even did the whole defending Trump's very fine people comment. Like, come on. It's why publications like the New York Times and the Atlantic obsessing over a manufactured campus wokeness hysteria again and again and again should have set off alarm bells. These were all steps along the way, and it wasn't just the most obvious MAGA right-wingers doing this stuff. And now we're in the thick of it, and a Nazi billionaire is dismantling the U.S. bit by bit with little to no resistance or actual actions from the Democrats. I mean, shutting down federal agencies and government departments, freezing funding to places he personally dislikes, and using rhetoric like U.S. aid is a viper's nest of radical left Marxists who hate America. Like, what the fuck? That is some Nazi-ass talk. Loud and clear. But none of this is new, as I was just saying. We've been hearing this type of rhetoric for years, and we have only empowered the people who spout it even more. You can hear echoes of Peterson in that unhinged statement by Elon, too. I remember I used to have this running thread of Peterson's outraged anti-diversity takes before he blocked me, and it was not a short thread. Like, sometimes he would just be mad that kindergartners were being taught words like acceptance and kindness, inclusion and diversity. Here's a quote from an article Jordan Peterson wrote in the National Post once. "My qualified and supremely trained, heterosexual, white male graduate students face a negligible chance of being offered university research positions despite stellar scientific dossiers. This is partly because of diversity, inclusivity, and equity mandates. My preferred acronym, DIE." So there you have it. Plain as day. The anxiety is that including others will somehow marginalize straight white men. Or at least that's the cover they give it. Because what they really want is to keep only straight white men at the top of the hierarchy. And they do not want that threatened. Their privileged position. They want to hold all the power. Others were just starting to be included in recent years, not prioritized, just included. And that didn't feel very good for some of these guys, so they completely lost their minds. They're bringing back the Third Reich because some corporations had begun to pay meaningless, for the most part, lip service to the idea of anti-racism, and they simply couldn't have that. Sam Harris, too, the inventor of logic and reason, has discussed that he believes there is structural racism working to the advantage of black and brown people. He means structural racism towards white people, of course. And he also occasionally drops phrases like the tyranny of equality and new forms of segregationism. Like, that is a level of paranoia he's felt to others simply being included in the same things straight white men always were.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nice mangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.